All right, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. Thanks for coming out this Wednesday afternoon for our Lunchtime Discovery series. Is there anybody for whom this is your first? I don't think so. Oh, fabulous. Welcome to the series. If you didn't know, we're here every Wednesday at noon inside the Daily Planet Theater, bringing you exciting and interesting topics in science and nature, and most of those topics bring you pretty close to home, because we're going to learn a lot about what's going on right here in North Carolina in most cases. And we pull in a number of experts across an incredible diversity of topics. Most of these folks are related to environmental professions in one way or another. And so this lecture series serves as a way for other science, nature, and environmental professionals to come in, and the public, hi everybody, to come in and join us for the presentation and learn something new, learn something interesting, and how it applies. This show every Wednesday is put on by us here in the museum. We have the space and the technology, but it's organized by the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education within DEQ. So many thanks to them for working with us and collaborating to put on what's turned out to be a really amazing resource for us to have here inside the museum every single week. The show is also broadcast online. Sometimes there are more people watching on the internet than there are watching here inside the theater, which is amazing because it means that we have a statewide reach and that this program has a much broader impact than just the folks who maybe have the opportunity to take their lunch break and come into the Daily Planet Theater. So all of that put together means that we've got a great show for you today and every week. Today's show is with Dr. Marcelo Ardon. He is over at NC State University, and I had the pleasure and privilege of getting what has amounted, I think, to a sneak peek of today's lecture, because he was a guest on a panel at the Museum of Art at a Science Friday event. They were talking about North Carolina wildlife habitats and research happening in the state at a special event. Dr. Ardon was on that panel and talked a little bit about the research that they've been doing on the ghost forests on the eastern part of our state. And so today we're going to get to see a little bit of what Science Friday worked on with him and his team, and I think learn something new. Put your hands together for Dr. Marcelo Ardon.
Thank you very much. Let's see, I'm not used to using this kind of a microphone, so it sounds okay? I'm not too close? Okay. So I'm a faculty over in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources at NC State University. I study carbon cycling, I study wetlands, I study streams, and what I'm here to talk to you about is a project that we've been working on, trying to use citizen scientists to map the health of forested wetlands along our coast. And so, first of all, I want to acknowledge that my graduate students have done the bulk of the actual work in this. You know, when I say we, I mean the royal we. A lot of this is work that they've done, and I take credit for, fairly or unfairly, but this is how it goes. We kind of all work together. And I also need to acknowledge funding from the National Science Foundation, because without their funding, none of this would be possible. So how did I get interested in these ghost forests or these forested wetlands along the coast? So going back to 2006, I finished my PhD at the University of Georgia, and I got a postdoc to come and work with Emily Bernhardt over at Duke University, looking at wetland restoration in the coast of North Carolina. And so we were studying this very large restored wetland where they planted 750,000 trees across about 1,000 acres. And we were studying this wetland and looking at how the trees grown. And we've been studying this pretty much continuously since 2006. But we were very interested in restoring these wetlands. How do you actually restore them? And so in order to figure out how it was changing, we were comparing it to what we consider natural wetlands nearby. So we found some areas that had been less impacted, and we were looking at those as our reference wetlands. Well, what happened in the first, pretty much 5 or 6 years of doing our research, I started noticing that our healthy wetlands, our reference wetlands, were actually changing, and they were changing in the opposite direction than our restored wetland. Our restored wetland was doing really well, the trees were growing a lot, they were very happy, while our reference wetlands the trees were dying, the canopy was opening up, the water level kept going up, and in some cases, marsh vegetation was starting to come in. In other cases, there was no marsh vegetation, and the forest pretty much just drowned and went into the sound. And so that got me really interested in thinking about what's causing these changes of these forested wetlands. Over what time frames did this happen? And what are the consequences? So I'm very interested in carbon and nutrients. What does it mean when you lose a forested wetland? What does it mean if that forested wetland turns into a marsh? And what does it mean if that forested wetland turns into open water in the sound? And so that's kind of what got me interested in looking at these kinds of questions. If we step back and think about what's causing the changes to these forested wetlands, at the largest scale, it probably has to do with sea level. We know that sea level is rising, and we know that the rate at which the sea level is rising is accelerating. So this is a figure from the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. This figure is a little bit outdated by now, but what I want you to notice is this is showing you, see how this works? Oh wait, I'm pressing the wrong button. Okay, there we go. Okay, so what this is showing you is tide gauges going back to about 1800 and how they've been increasing over time. And this is a global average. So on average, the level of the sea or the oceans has risen by about, well, here it's showing 0.15 meters, 150 millimeters. That's about 8 inches, which doesn't sound like a lot. This is a global average, and so when you look at specific places, it can definitely be a lot more in some places, it can be a lot less in other places. But what's also important to notice is that the rate of this change is accelerating. So I put just that between 1901 and 1990, the rate was about 1.5 millimeters per year. And it has gone up to about 3.2 if you look at the latter part of that period, so from 1993 to 2010. So this is accelerating, right? And we have a hard time understanding problems that are accelerating. We have a hard time, we have car accidents because of acceleration. We have a hard time understanding compound interest and those kinds of things. So this is a problem where sea level, that rate is accelerating. And most of the models that we have suggest that that's even going to get worse. And so these are model projections going out to 2100, and the different colors are different scenarios. So the IPCC comes up with these different scenarios. If we keep doing what we're doing right now and don't change anything, then you're going to have the red, and you could have up to 1 meter of sea level rise. If we change and decrease the amount of CO2, the amount of carbon dioxide that we're emitting into the atmosphere, then we might have less than that. But we know things are going to be getting worse. And so again, these are at the global scale. And it's important to remember that it's not the same everywhere. I mentioned that before. So if we look at the vulnerability, so places that are more likely to be affected by sea level rise, it's not the same everywhere. So this map, the red colors show you areas that are very vulnerable to sea level rise. And you can see that North Carolina right here is lots of red and orange colors. That means that we're very vulnerable to sea level rise in the coming future, in the coming decades. So this is data from a tide gauge. So there are these tide gauges where people have gone out there and measured the level of the sea for a long time. This particular data set comes from Beaufort, North Carolina, so trying to focus on what does it mean here in North Carolina. And you can see that the sea level has been rising by about, again, similar to that rate that I showed you, the global, about 3 millimeters per year. You can see very clearly that that line is going up. If I can get this to work, ooh, going up. And so this one is going to from about 1920, I think the latest data here I think was like last year, or actually it goes till this year. And so I always have a hard time when talking about these global things. Okay, so now I'm showing you North Carolina, but what does this mean in terms of a human lifespan, and what does it mean in terms of what we're going to see in the changes? And so here's my attempt at trying to bring it down to what it means for somebody's lifetime. So that's a picture of my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather actually lived to be 110 years old. So this is not, that key right there is showing you kind of like the last 80 years of his life. And so I calculated that in the last 80 years of his life, and I should mention, he did not live in Beaufort, he lived in Costa Rica, but I'm just using him for the time span, okay? So in like the last 80 years of his life, the sea rose 8 inches there in Beaufort, North Carolina. In the 40 years that I've been alive, it's risen about 8 inches. So half of the time that, in the half time of my lifespan, it has risen the same amount as 80 years of my great-grandfather's lifetime. And so that also gets me to think of, well, what's going to happen in my kids' lifetime? What's it going to look like for, when they grow up? What's Beaufort going to look like when they grow up? And so this is a map showing a projection, again, going out to 2100, assuming about 1.1 meters of sea level. And that dark blue part is not Duke colors, but that's areas, go right here. All of this dark blue is areas that would likely be inundated under 1.1 meters of sea level rise by 2100 in North Carolina. So you can see that a lot of our coast is vulnerable to sea level rise. Now, I got to say that I use this map a lot in talks, but I also think that these maps are not necessarily the most efficient or most effective way of presenting this information, and I think we have to come up with better ways to think about. Because what if your household is that red dot there? People who live there don't like to look at these kinds of maps, and usually their response is, well, that's 2100, that's a long time from now, I really don't need to care about this or do anything about it. And I don't think that's necessarily the best response. This kind of map reminds me of this kind of map where you see terrible things happen and then terrible things happen more slowly, so everybody's doomed. But that's not the right response, I don't think. I think we need to figure out what exactly are the problems, where is the most vulnerable places likely to be, and what can we do about it? Are there things that we can do to try to prevent change, or are there places that we, give up on technically, or at least decide that it's going to be too expensive to try to protect them, and figure out what are the places that are likely to be that we can actually protect, and how do we protect them? So one of the ways that we've been thinking about this is using this kind of model, and I just like this figure to show that these wetlands change. As the sea level changes, these wetlands change. And so we likely have areas that have forested wetlands. And if you have sea level rise, increased flooding, increased storms, those forests can change into a marsh, and that could be either a high marsh or a low marsh. And then eventually, if change continues to come over, then you can have what they call subtidal, or I just call it open water. So basically, you can have these state changes from a forest to a marsh to open water. And this was a model that was developed by researchers this is Mark Brinson over at ECU, but he was doing work in the Virginia coast. And one of the things we started to notice when we tried to apply this model to the North Carolina coast was that sometimes we didn't have the marsh state. The forests jumped directly into this open water and subtidal. We're trying to figure out why that was. And so this model might or might not apply to here to North Carolina. We're still trying to figure out, but to me, this change of a forest into an open water is a lot more significant than the change from a forest to a marsh. So a forest to a marsh, both of those are wetlands. Marsh supports certain species of birds. Forests support other species of birds. You know, if you're a marsh bird lover, you might think this is great. This is more habitat for birds. When it comes to carbon, marshes actually sequester more carbon than forests, sometimes. And so thinking about those changes is important, but it might be that changing one wetland for another is not that big of a deal. But when you change a forest to open water, those are very different ecosystems, and that might have much more important consequences than just changing one wetland. Doing is trying to ask the public to help us map these areas. It's hard to map these areas using satellite images, though we've been working on that as well. But we've started trying to ask people to take pictures of these systems and send those pictures to us so that we can start building a baseline of what do these forests look like right now, how are they changing, where are the places where they're changing the most, and what can we do about this? So that's the website for the project. We call it Sentinels and Sea. This is a map where people, you know, have sent us pictures of these different trees. Trees. Why cypress trees? For one thing, they're widespread across the southeast. They are very long-lived trees. I don't know if you guys heard, but over the summer there was some news that they found a tree that was 2,500 years old in the Black River here in North Carolina. So that makes it the oldest tree outside of California, and I think it's the 5th oldest tree in the world. So they dated it using tree rings. So these trees have been there for a long time, and we think they can tell us a lot about how the coast has been changing. I like to show this picture. This is from Thomas Harriot's original book, manuscript, where he talks about cypress trees. He calls them rakiok, and that's the what he thinks is the Algonquin word for cypress trees. He describes how they built canoes out of these trees. Colleagues from ECU have dug out these kinds of canoes from the bottom of lakes out in the coast. You know, they found them. The wood is very resistant to decay, so they've been there for a long time. And he describes here how they burn the bottom to form the canoes. I've been thinking about this word a lot. I like that word, rakiok. I don't know why, I just like how it sounds. And recently I learned about this word called rampike, which I had never heard before, but apparently this is a word that I guess landscape architects use to describe a dead tree. And because these dead trees are becoming more common, then this word is being used a little bit more. And I just think it's interesting to think about these two words and how similar they are, but how they can indicate very different things. Rakiok kind of indicating the longevity. To me, it's crazy to think about, you know, that tree in the Black River was alive when the Europeans got to North Carolina, right? That tree was probably called rakiok by the Native Americans that lived in the area. And now we think about rampike and these trees that are changing because the conditions are changing at a much faster rate than they've ever changed before. I also just like cypress trees, and I keep saying that the North Carolina logo, to me, that really looks like a cypress tree. I don't know what you think. I think officially they say it's a pine tree, but as far as I know, pine trees don't have buttresses, and this looks to me like it has a buttress. So, cypress trees are also flood tolerant, so they tend to hang around for much longer than many other species. They're also salt tolerant, so they can hang around for much longer. They do require dry land to germinate. So if you see these trees out in the water, that area had to have been dry land for at least a couple of years in order for that seed to germinate and for it to get established. And so, you know, people take pictures of these trees out in the water, and we've collected some of those, but all of those areas used to be dry land. So we're wondering if, I don't know if you can see that very well. I kind of hand drew a brown line there of where it could have been a shoreline. This is a picture from the Albemarle Sound that we took with a drone. We've also been developing classroom curriculum. So we have two similar but separate classroom curriculum developed by teachers that worked in my lab over the summer. So these are targeted towards middle school. So both of them were 5th and 6th grade teachers. And what we've been trying to do is to use Google Earth to map how these areas are changing. Ann Diddleson was from Beaufort County, and so she used images from Washington to look at coastal change. And then Marcy McKinley used images from the Cape Fear River to look at how those have changed. And we have those classroom curriculum available on my website. So what have we been getting from the citizen science? So we launched it in 2016. I can't believe it's been that long. It doesn't feel like it's been that long. We've had a couple of issues with the platforms that we used. We had been using one platform, but it was giving us too many problems, so we moved over to the iNaturalist. Who's familiar with iNaturalist? Some of you are. That's good. I suggest you go and check it out. It's a great platform. It's a great app. You know, it's something you can have on your phone. You can take a picture of whatever you're looking at. If you find a weird insect or a weird plant, you take a picture of it. It's actually gotten to where it'll give you suggestions as to what it think it is, because it has a big enough database now. If you know what it is, you can say what it is, and you put it up there, and people will go back and check it and tell you whether or not it was right. If it wasn't right, they'll correct it. But it's a great community of naturalists, and they do it for all kinds of you know, organisms. You know, everything from I like to put pictures there of fungi whenever I'm walking in the forest. If I see funny-looking mushrooms, I take pictures of those and put them on there, and then eventually people tell me what they are. I don't know much about them, I just like them. So we're using the iNaturalist as a project on there. You can go on there and look for sentinels and see, and it'll come up. And I can't say enough good things about iNaturalist, so go check it out. So we've been getting these kinds of pictures, and we've been trying to use that to map both healthy, degraded, and you know, dying forests. We have this kind of goal initially that we were going to use it to actually map and try to connect our citizen science pictures with satellite images. But the accuracy of a lot of the phones is not that great, particularly in the areas that we're working on where the reception is not that great. So, you know, sometimes it's like a 5-meter uncertainty, but sometimes it's like 100 meters. And when it gets that big, it's been hard to actually use that data to map. But we're still working on it and trying to figure out better ways to connect those. We've also, we asked people to rate whether the trees they're looking at are healthy or stressed or very stressed, and then we've downloaded the data, and then one of my grad students went through all of them, and she classified it herself, and then we compared it to citizen scientists. And overall, we found good agreement. We found differences between what is healthy versus very healthy, which is not that big of a problem. So we feel like we can use this data to assess the health of these systems. We might not be able to use this data to map these systems very accurately. But at least we can get a range of an idea of where these are. This is just us trying to put those trees. I know this is really hard to see, but we're trying to map the trees and overlay it on conductivity data, so salinity data that's been collected by different agencies. We got this from the EPA STORIT data set, if you're familiar. Again, we still have the problem with the accuracy in these, but at least it gives us an idea. I don't know if you can see very well, but there's red triangles in areas that tend to have higher salinity, which is kind of what we would expect in areas that we know are changing rapidly. I wanted to show you just some of the pictures that people have been posting on here. These trees to me are magical, and it's just, they're very beautiful, they're very majestic. Sometimes the trees don't look so healthy. Other times they look very nice and healthy. Sometimes we can tell how the trees are doing if they look nice and green. Other times it's hard because the trees are backlit. I like this picture from, somebody took this one around the Chowan River this past summer, and there was an algal bloom, so you can see the algal bloom there in the front and the trees in the back. I care about algal blooms as well. That's part of the research that we do in my lab, so I really like this picture. One of the things that we're going to start doing soon is, so far what we've gotten is an idea of spatial extent. We've gotten pictures that gives us an idea of healthy forest and degraded forest in a spatial kind of dimension. Now we want to try to get at how are these things changing through time. And so in order to do that is we're going to identify stations. We're going to put these stations where people can go in, and we'll put a little stand like this one, and people can go in and put their phone and take a picture, and then they'll email us the picture, and that way we can follow a specific place over time, and that'll give us a better idea. We're going to try to identify areas that we know are healthy, areas that we know are degraded, and areas that we know are changing rapidly, to see if we can capture those changes through citizen science images. So we're doing a lot of work associated with the ghost forests. The citizen science is one part of it, but I also wanted to show you a video, in part because I just think it's a really cool video, but show you a little bit more about other work that we're doing out in this area. And so this was a video that was put together by a producer from the NPR radio show Science Friday. And this was the video that was highlighted that in the Museum of Art event that was mentioned at the beginning. So here we go.
A ghost forest is a very clever name for a kind of unfortunate new habitat type we're seeing growing on the coast. And it's a place where you have a lot of dead trees, large areas of contiguous forest that are just gone.
My emotional response is to mourn the loss of those trees. But scientifically, I say, what was the combination of stresses that caused this particular stand of trees to bite the dust?
We've been doing this now for close to a decade, and in that time, we've already been seeing changes. If these things are changing on a timescale where I can see it, what's going to happen for this landscape, by the time my kids grow up? My name is Marcelo Ardon, and I study ecosystem ecology and biogeochemistry of streams and wetlands.
And I'm Lily Bernhardt, and I'm a biogeochemist and aquatic ecologist.
And I'm Ryan Emanuel, and I'm a hydrologist.
Believe it or not, back in 2004, this was a really large 440-acre farm that was purchased by a group of developers who decided to turn it into a wetland. because we were studying this wetland restoration project, it didn't even occur to us that saltwater would get here. And we recognized a year after the first intrusion event happened that we had gotten to near brackish conditions in much of this wetland.
And that's what kind of led us into this research of saltwater intrusion and trying to understand if the patterns we had seen in this restored wetland were also happening in the broader area of the Albemarle-Pamlico Peninsula.
The Albemarle-Pamlico Peninsula is a landscape that's dominated by water.
So we have the Pamlico Sound in the south and the Albemarle Sound in the north. We have the big Alligator River sort of cutting down through the middle of this peninsula.
Ecologically speaking, this used to be all dominated by wetlands, tends to have very organic, rich, peaty soils, and it's a system that would sequester a lot of carbon in the soils.
The Albemarle-Pamlico Peninsula has a history of large-scale commercial agriculture, vast tracts of land that are used for corn, soybean, crops like that.
Really pretty late in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, huge parts of the coastal plain, forested wetlands were drained with sort of mechanized drainage systems, canals, ditches, etc., to pump water off and keep them dry enough to farm.
No matter where you go on the peninsula, you can see some type of artificial drainage infrastructure.
You can even use Google Earth and Google Maps, and you can see some of these changes, on your computer.
Even though they were made to drain water from the interior out to the estuary, there's the potential for them to serve the opposite purpose. You can have storms that push salt water deep into the interior, often through ditches and drains that may not have flow control structures or other protective measures.
Now when you have a drought, the sounds get saltier, in part because they're evaporating and in part because they're not getting fresh water off the landscape. So you start to see those salts mixing up.
You could actually have gradients of salt water that penetrate deep into the interior through these ditches and drains. One of the impacts of climate change is a likely increase in the number and severity of droughts and the intensity of storms. In both of those cases, we're actually influencing different types of saltwater intrusions.
The thing that's actually happening is that salt is getting into a landscape and killing individual organisms, be they trees or microbes. So it's actually happening at a very granular scale. But what we want to know, and I think what most people want to know, is how the coast of North Carolina is going to change as a result of saltwater intrusion. Our team is a hydrologist, two biogeochemists, a plant ecologist, and a social scientist, all trying to think about how can we bring our expertise to bear in this really multi-layered, difficult question.
We're collecting data from more than a dozen sites around the peninsula.
So we measure the water chemistry, we measure the water level, nutrients are there, how much salt is in there. We also monitor the soils, the chemistry of the soil, we look at the greenhouse gas emissions. And then we've also started measuring greenhouse gases from trees. Is the tree functioning like a chimney? So is it taking gases that are being produced by microbes in the soil and releasing them out into the atmosphere? Or is it more like a cork, and is it actually helping to keep gases that the microbes are producing in the soil within the soil?
All of these things are monitored continuously at a handful of sites around the peninsula, but we also have handheld tools that we can use to make spot checks as we drive around broadly.
What we would really like to do is link what we're seeing with vegetation, areas where we know there's saltwater intrusion occurring, to what we're seeing in the soil. So yes, there's salinization here. This is what the trees do when that happens. We really wanted to have a little bit more control, and if you want to have control as a scientist, what you do is an experiment. So we're adding salt alone and salt with nutrients and nutrients alone, and we're trying to understand if we keep doing that, what happens? Do the leaves seem stressed? Are they water stressed? If we can start to see those things from space, we could detect saltwater stress at a much larger scale.
Using geospatial data, we can try to see if what we see in these small places are going to apply to much larger areas.
We're currently using digital elevation models to assess how vulnerable the landscape is to saltwater intrusion. We're using these algorithms that tell us how water concentrates and flows across the surface, and how connected or disconnected different parts of the landscape are to one another, combining those metrics in ways that allow us to come up with an estimate of vulnerability. And when I look at those maps, I get a sense of the magnitude of this problem. Some of those salts can stay behind in the soils, so you may see reduced yields in crops, and there are forests nearby. That could be one of the factors that leads them to become ghost forests. We think that ghost forests are spreading throughout the Albemarle-Pamlico Peninsula and throughout many parts of the eastern U.S. The pace of sea level rise and the intensity of human modification of the landscape have accelerated that process. I've never worked on a project where the change is happening at such a rapid time scale.
It is possible that we might not fully understand this problem before it's too late. So this area is actually one of the highest sea level rise rates in the country.
You could be very fatalistic and say, just let it go underwater. And I think that would be unfortunate if that's the decision that we make. There's the enormous standing stock of carbon in the trees and the soils of all these coastal wetlands that could be lost back to the atmosphere. And then there's the biodiversity loss. If we lose these so fast, we're just going to lose this really important ecoregion. Where we can be hopeful is that there are a lot of things that we could do to manage this landscape differently than just abandoning it to the sea.
One of the things we hope to do with our research is to provide decision makers with tools that they can use to potentially mitigate some of the effects of saltwater intrusion that are caused by ditches and drains.
Rather than it being an on or off switch where it has to be either we build a ditch or we plug it, can we find ways where we allow water to move in one direction but not maybe allow it to move in another direction, or even maybe trying to figure out if there are maybe crops that would be more salt tolerant that are growing out here. And the same thing for these wetlands. So restoring it to what used to be here historically is probably not going to be the smartest idea. And starting to think about what species are going to do well, can we use those species for restoration? If you have ecological collapse, you're going to have agricultural collapse. But I tend to be an optimistic person, and so I hope that people that are making the decisions to make changes are going to hear what we have to say.
If we do nothing and we continue to farm, we continue to build infrastructure as if these forests and these systems are not going to change, then we might be in for some really rotten surprises in a few decades.
I think humans can have a huge impact on both whether new ghost forests develop, whether current ghost forests expand, and also what happens now once a ghost forest exists on the landscape. Do we leave them? Could we manage them in a way that we might actually move more rapidly into a sort of a salt marsh ecosystem? I think there's a lot of interesting decisions that we could begin to make. They're not going to be forests in those places probably again, but they might be something equally interesting and beautiful.
Hello. How are y'all? Good. Did you watch the video? Yeah. Did you like my orange hat? So that's my I'm not a deer hat. Do you understand why it's my I'm not a deer hat? The places where we do research, there's a lot of hunting that goes around. And so we have to wear bright orange hats so we make sure the hunters see us. So I really like that video. The guy did a really good job. It was interesting because I've never been involved in anything like this. You know, we spent about 2 days out showing him our sites and showing him what we do. And he interviewed Emily, Ryan, and I individually. So he asked us the same questions, but we weren't allowed to hear what the other one would say. And then, he chopped it up and put it together. And it's amazing how much we agreed in our answers, because some of those answers were not things that we talk a lot about. Like, he asked us how it makes us feel. We're like, feel. How do we feel about these things? We don't normally sit around and talk about that. We normally just talk about data and maps and that kind of thing. But it was a really good experience, and like we said, it was showed in the Museum of Art, and I like showing it here just because I think it's a good way to raise awareness about this, and he did such a good job showing it. I just have a couple of more slides. I think, this is the project that was highlighted in that video. So Ryan Emanuel, he's a hydrologist at NC State, working with us. Todd Bender, he's a regional planner, so he's more of a social scientist, and his role in the project was to help us understand how people are seeing these problems and trying to understand how they're, whether or not they see it as a problem, and if they do, what they're doing about it. He wasn't able to come out for the filming, and Emily, and then Justin Wright, who's also at Duke. Justin is a plant community ecologist, and he's been in charge of doing the vegetation part of the project. Justin is married to Emily, so Emily came out for the filming, but Justin had to stay and watch their daughters. So this are just some images that, the map I've shown you, it's shown in the video. The image in the middle is what we've been trying to develop, a saltwater intrusion vulnerability index, trying to understand what areas of the peninsula are most vulnerable to saltwater. And then eventually we're going to try to use these and the citizen science to ground truth. Is the vulnerability index really telling us what's happening on the ground? And then I just have an image of the ditches, which the video does such a good job of illustrating and thinking about how those ditches are changing this area. And we designed these ditches to move water off of the landscape, but at the same time, they can facilitate salt moving into the landscape and going much further inland. In working through all of this, I found this USGS report from it was 1976, so a year before I was born. And they talked about how saltwater intrusion could be caused by these ditches. And I was like, great. That was in 1976. Here we are in 2018, 2019, verifying what they thought would be a problem back in 1976. All right, so I just have a couple of conclusions here. We know that our coast is changing. I like Stan Riggs, my colleague from ECU, always says that the only constant is change out in the coast, and I think that's a great way to think about it. I think that citizen science can help us track that change and help us understand that, and I think it's a good way to get people involved and caring about these kinds of issues. And I think we really need some creative ways to talk about these problems so that we can come up with some creative solutions. It's really going to take a lot of people thinking about this hard. These are not going to be easy solutions. It's going to take a lot of thinking, a lot of planning, and being creative and coming up with solutions is going to take a lot of us. And the same kind of thinking that got us into these problems is not going to get us out of it. And so, I think I have time for questions or, if you have suggestions, I'm also happy to hear those.
Let's give Marcelo a round of applause. Thank you. So if you're down here on the first floor and you've got questions, I already saw hands go up. I'll bring you a microphone. If you're up on the second or third floors, you can ask questions too. Just wave down at us, and then you'll have to yell at us. But we'll use our microphones to repeat the questions and make sure everyone can hear.
Hi there. Thank you so much. In the YouTube movie, I think it was you that said you would not plant the same trees that were there. You kind of learned from that. So what other species have you all discovered that you will plant or have planted?
So that's a good question, and the answer is I don't have a good answer yet. So we're trying to come up with what could be the best species to plant out there, and we're doing that in a couple of ways. We've done a lot of surveys to look at what are what's the vegetation that's already there, what are the species that do best under high salinity? And we know some of those, right? We know what are the marsh species, but I don't think it's as easy as just planting marsh species. There's a lot of shrubs that do relatively well, and the shrubs might actually be even better at sequestering carbon in the soil than some of the marsh species. So one of the grants that we're working on right now is to do some experiments where we plant some of these different species together to see how they do, and how do they do under salt water, how do they do under increased flooding, how do they do under drought, because that's another issue. So, you know, the conditions that these plants are experiencing are changing, so we have to try to figure out how they're going to do under all these different stresses.
Yeah, thanks. I've also been down east, and I've seen some of these large farm operations with these large canals. So these large farms and the farmers must, obviously they have an economic interest, so the farmers must be equally interested in protection of saltwater protection. So are they coming up with good solutions? Are you kind of working with them, or?
So that's a great question. So it's interesting because farmers in certain areas are not seeing saltwater intrusion or damage to their crops yet. So what we found is that if you look at the Albemarle-Pamlico Peninsula, the main area where we've been working, most of the farmers there are not complaining a lot about harm from increased salinization or increased salinity. But farmers on the north part of the Sound have been seeing a lot of crop damage, and they think it has to do with salt water. So some of my colleagues, Alex Manda from ECU, has been working a lot with farmers there to figure out, is it really salt water that's causing the harm of their crops? So they definitely have an economic interest. It's interesting because I think the part that we've been working on, they might not be seeing damage from increased salinity, but they are seeing damage from increased flooding. And so both of those are connected, right? In the end, if the sea is going up, that creates more pressure and it causes the groundwater tables to go up. We've also had the last couple of years have been really wet, right? Because of hurricanes, and they've just been really wet. And so it could be that it's this changing storms and changing sea levels which are causing increased flooding. We have been talking with the farmers more about the increased flooding than about the increased salinity. But they're definitely interested in it. And again, we're also trying to find funding to keep working with them and coming up with potential solutions.
So I saw it in the video in the maps with, just an example would be, how are they going to even try to preserve the biodiversity with that area you highlighted as the Alligator National Wildlife Reserve, which is one of the most rich biodiversities in all of the Carolinas? Is it ditch management? Is there any hope for it?
Okay, so I always got to answer without saying that there's always hope. I think that there's always hope, right? And we just have to figure out what it is what are the priorities for this area, and what it is that would we like to preserve, and how are we going to preserve that, right? So, you know, you look at places like the Netherlands, they have been dealing with sea level rise for a really long time, and they have a very extensive system of seawalls and levees, and all of that could be done. It's just going to be really expensive, right? In Alligator River itself, there is a lot more forest than there is marsh. So it could be that in the short term, if we have a lot of that forest turn into a marsh, we could end up with a net gain of wetland area, which is weird to think about. Most of the times we talk about sea level rise, we talk about losing all of these wetlands. But when you look at the amount of marsh versus the amount of forest, there's a lot more forest than there is marsh. It could mean that there's a loss of that forest, right? And so that, for certain species, the tree-dwelling species, that might not be a good thing, but for marshes, it could be good. So I think there is hope. I just think we have to be careful about how we think about this. Like I said, we have this grant trying to figure out what species should you plant there. And also, you know, one of the things we've been thinking about is like, well, we can think about if we have an area that has already been degraded and turned into a marsh, what species should we plant there to make it into a shrub? It might not be a forest, but it might be like a scrub shrub, right? The other part of it is, if we have a forest that we already know is likely going to change in the coming decades, what should we do? Should we go and open up the canopy and allow the marsh species to come in? And then should we log it? Should we get those trees and use them for something? Should we cut the trees down and lay that carbon on the ground? There's so many different things that could be done. It's just a matter of how much money are we going to put into it? How much do we care about this? But I'll say it again. I always think that there is hope. We just have to be willing to work on it and figure it out.
Thank you.
I was curious in your last slide, that kind of rough map of vulnerability that you had up there. What kind of time scale are you using when you're thinking about those levels of vulnerability? And I was also curious about what are some of the places that are most vulnerable that I should visit now?
Oh, that's a great question. What is the time frame for those vulnerability maps? So I guess our idea has been to try to come up with places that are going to be vulnerable in the coming decades. So that map does not take into account sea level rise so it mostly, that map has to do with elevation and freshwater discharge. So it's mostly something that would likely be vulnerable in the coming decades. In terms of areas that you should visit, I think you should go visit the whole coast. All of it is beautiful, and we should, you know, just try to spend as much time as we can out there. So.
For those of us who are, say, environmental educators, and we wanted to show people these places, maybe not the healthy forests, which have a great story to tell, but also ghost forests, which have another very good story that we should and can tell and that you're telling. Are these places that folks can get to, or do we need research permits and drones in order to get out to see some of these environments?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. These are definitely places that people can get to, and I'm sure driving around, you can see them off of the highway. There's many of these that are close by. So a lot of the area that we work around is, if you take Highway 64 going out east, you know, that will take you to Alligator River, which has a fair amount of it. I've been amazed the last couple of times I've been driving past Wilmington, just the highways around Wilmington, you look around and you see all these dead trees with, you know, standing with the marshes. Usually it's a little bit hard to just park on the side of the highway and get to walk around and look at these places. I think one place that I like to take my students is actually in Columbia, North Carolina. So there's the Scuppernong River right there, and Poquoson Lakes Wildlife Refuge has a very nice boardwalk. And the trees there are generally looking healthy, but some of them you can start seeing some of the trees are stressed, because I think there is probably that the water level has been going up. So I think that's a good area that you can take students, and it's probably one of the places where we'll put one of those stations that I mentioned in for the citizen science.
One more round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming out and sharing with us. Thanks to all of you for coming out to the Lunchtime Discovery Show here in the Daily Planet Theater. We'll see you again next week at noon right here. Bye, everybody.